While you scroll through social media in late October 2025, hundreds were dying in election violence that the world's most powerful democracy chose to ignore with nothing more than a travel warning. A nation of 68 million people held what might be the most brutal election of the year. Bodies were allegedly dumped in secret locations. The internet went dark. Opposition leaders sat in prison cells, charged with treason for demanding reform on social media. When the votes were counted, the president claimed victory with 97.66%, winning every single constituency in a result no independent observer believed. The world condemned it. The United Nations called for investigations. European nations issued joint statements of alarm. But from Washington, silence. A travel advisory. Nothing more. Yet 3,000 kilometers west, another African leader was making headlines for entirely different reasons. Not for silencing opposition, but for empowering farmers. Not for shutting down the internet, but for opening transparent dashboards. Not for hiding bodies, but for filling silos. Same month, same continent. Two completely different choices about what leadership means. This is the story of October 2025, the month Africa sought two paths clearly. Tanzania chose the old playbook: maintain power through fear, control through violence, rule through suppression. But another nation chose revolution, not the revolution of slogans and speeches, but the revolution of ledgers and loans, of transparency and trust, of sovereignty built not on bullets, but on balance sheets. Do not look away. What comes next may change how we read the map. If you believe in these stories, give us your like, leave your thoughts, and subscribe to continue this journey together. Two nations, two leaders, two visions of what Africa can become. One planted seeds of fear and reaped silence. The other planted seeds of hope and reaped a harvest the world is still learning to measure. The difference between them might reshape how we understand African leadership in the 21st century. Tanzania is a country most people know for safaris, Mount Kilimanjaro, and those pristine beaches of Zanzibar. What they do not know is that the same political party has controlled this nation since independence in 1961. 64 years of unbroken rule. The party calls itself Chama cha Mapinduzi, the Party of the Revolution. But by October 2025, the only thing being revolutionized was democracy itself, straight into the grave. President Samia Suluhu Hassan became Tanzania's first female leader in 2021 when her predecessor died suddenly in office. For a brief, shining moment, people dared to hope. She spoke of opening political space. She eased restrictions on the media. She promised a new Tanzania where voices could be heard without fear. That hope lasted exactly 3 years. By 2024, opposition members started disappearing. Some turned up dead in ditches. Others were never found at all. Journalists received midnight phone calls warning them to stay silent. Even a TikTok creator who dared criticize the government vanished into thin air. And lurking behind this climate of terror was an allegation that chilled the nation to its bones. Multiple sources accused the president's own son of orchestrating the torture, the abductions, the killings. The real turning point came on April 9, 2025. That was the day they came for Tundu Lissu. Lissu was the leader of Chadema, Tanzania's main opposition party. This was a man who had been shot 16 times in an assassination attempt back in 2017. 16 bullets. He survived, fled the country, and only returned because he believed, truly believed, in fighting for democracy. He thought Tanzania deserved better than 64 years of one-party rule. On that April morning, police arrested him at a rally in Kokani. They drove him over 1,000 kilometers through the night to the capital, Dar es Salaam. His crime? Calling for electoral reform on social media. His charge? Treason, a crime that carries the death penalty in Tanzania. Think about that for a moment. A man survives 16 bullets, returns from exile to fight for democracy, and gets charged with treason for posting about electoral reform on Facebook. This was the Tanzania heading into the election of 2025. Election day was October 29th. On paper, 17 candidates were running for president. In reality, Hassan was the only choice. The real candidates were either in prison, banned from campaigning, or had fled the country in fear for their lives. Then the chaos started. Protests erupted across Tanzania like wildfire. In Dar es Salaam, a city of over 7 million people, massive crowds took to the streets. They tore down campaign posters bearing Hassan's face. They set fire to government buildings. They chanted for democracy, for change, for an end to 64 years of suffocation. The government's response was swift, brutal, and absolute. The military was deployed. Security forces fired tear gas into crowds of civilians. Then came the live ammunition. Witnesses reported seeing people shot in the streets like animals. Hospitals in Dar es Salaam began filling with bodies. But here is where the story takes its most sinister turn. Families were denied access to collect their dead relatives unless they had special permits from the police. Then the internet went dark. The government shut down mobile internet and social media across the entire country. Net blocks and Access Now, international organizations that monitor internet freedom, confirmed the blackout was complete. A nationwide curfew was imposed. Schools closed. It was a total information lockdown, and nobody could get news in or out. For 3 days, Tanzania became a black hole of information. No tweets, no Facebook posts, no WhatsApp messages, no phone calls. 68 million people were cut off from the world and from each other. In that darkness, anything could happen, and according to the opposition, it did. On November 1st, Tanzania's Electoral Commission announced the results. Hassan had won with 97.66% of the vote. She won every single constituency, all 184 of them. To put that in perspective, even dictators rarely claim such overwhelming victories. Her predecessor in the previous election had received just 12.5 million votes. The mathematics of Hassan's victory defied all logic. The opposition began reporting death tolls that made the world gasp. The United Nations said at least 32 people had lost their lives. But Chadema claimed the real number could be as high as 723 confirmed dead, with estimates reaching over 1,200. Then came the most disturbing allegations of all. The opposition accused police of stopping families from collecting bodies from hospitals and secretly dumping over 400 corpses in undisclosed locations across the country. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International later confirmed that bodies had been hidden in unmarked graves at Mukuranga and Bunju cemeteries, far from the capital where international observers might notice. President Hassan made no public comment about the violence for days. When she was finally sworn in on November 3rd, it was not in a public stadium where Tanzanians could witness their democracy. It was at Chamazi military base, behind closed doors, surrounded by soldiers instead of citizens. In her inaugural speech, she acknowledged that people had died, but provided no numbers. She blamed the protests on foreign interference, the oldest excuse in the authoritarian playbook. She spoke of unity while her opponents sat in prison cells. She promised development while bodies lay hidden in secret graves. And what was the response from the world's most powerful democracy? On October 30th, the United States Embassy in Tanzania told American citizens to shelter in place. That was it. On October 31st, the State Department upgraded Tanzania's travel advisory to Level 3, Reconsider Travel. There was no statement from the White House, no condemnation from the Secretary of State, no call for accountability, no demand for investigations, just a travel advisory warning Americans to stay away. Compare that to the response from the European Union, the United Kingdom, Norway, and Canada, who issued joint statements condemning the violence and calling for independent investigations. The African Union expressed deep concern. Even smaller nations found their voice to speak against the massacre. But from America, the nation that claims to champion democracy around the world, nothing but silence and a travel warning. The message was clear. Tanzania's democracy could die in the darkness, and Washington would not even bother to turn on a light. Let us take a moment here, not to rush forward, but to give thanks. Write a comment with a simple thank you to the brave opposition leaders still fighting, to the families still searching for missing relatives, or to the spirit of democracy itself. Gratitude is not a formality. It is recognition. It is dignity expressed in words. When you add your voice of thanks, you are not just engaging with a video. You are standing in solidarity with a story that demands to be remembered. So, before we continue, take this pause to comment your thank you. Together, those words become a beacon that shines far beyond the screen. While Tanzania's government was deploying soldiers into the streets, shutting down the internet, and allegedly hiding bodies in secret locations, another African nation just 3,000 kilometers away was doing something completely different. While Samia Hassan was celebrating a 97.66% victory built on fear and hidden graves, another leader was celebrating something else entirely, a 92.3% repayment rate built on trust and transparent ledgers. While Tanzania was spending resources on military crackdowns and internet blackouts, another country was spending resources on agricultural credit and digital transparency. While one nation was jailing opposition leaders for calling for reform, another was empowering 1 million rural families with capital to transform their lives. Two nations, same continent, same month. Two completely different definitions of what power means. Tanzania chose the old playbook, the playbook that says strength comes from silencing dissent, that stability comes from crushing opposition, that leadership means making people fear you more than they love their own freedom. But this other nation chose a different kind of revolution. Not the revolution of slogans and speeches that we have heard 1,000 times before. Not the revolution of ideology and empty promises. This was the revolution of ledgers and loans, of transparency and trust, of sovereignty built not on bullets and ballots, but on balance sheets and harvests. This nation understood something that Tanzania's leadership had forgotten. True power is not what you can take from people, but what you can help them build for themselves. The country was Burkina Faso. And the revolution they launched in August 2025 would prove that in an age of internet shutdowns and election manipulation, the most radical act a government can perform is this: trust its people with capital and watch them prove that trust was justified. On August 15, 2025, Burkina Faso launched the Programme Présidential de Crédit Agricole Souverain, the presidential program for sovereign agricultural credit. The numbers alone tell a story that reshapes how we think about African development. $2.4 billion over 3 years, $800 million disbursed in 2025 alone. 1 million farming families, each receiving between $3,000 and $4,100 at 6% annual interest, with payments deferred until after harvest season. But here is what makes this revolution different from every other development program Africa has seen. It was not aid. It was credit. It was not charity. It was investment. It was not dependency. It was sovereignty. Every single transaction was recorded through mobile money and biometric identification. Every loan disbursed was tracked in real time on a public dashboard at creditagricole.gov.bf, a website that any person anywhere in the world could visit to see exactly how much money was being lent, to whom, and how much was being repaid. No hidden accounts, no secret budgets, no mysteriously vanishing funds. Just radical transparency in a continent where government finances have traditionally been as opaque as Tanzania's internet blackout. The pilot program had been tested in 6 provinces with 200,000 families during 2024 and early 2025. The results were so extraordinary that international auditors from the World Bank were called in to verify them independently. Repayment rate, 92.3%. Read that number again. In a continent where development aid has created cycles of dependency spanning decades, where governments have defaulted on international loans, where corruption has swallowed billions of dollars meant for the poor, Burkina Faso achieved a 92.3% repayment rate from smallholder farmers. But the transformation went far beyond numbers on a balance sheet. Average productivity increased by 34% for millet and sorghum, the staple crops that feed the nation. Food import costs dropped by $120 million in a single harvest season. For the first time in decades, the word aid began to disappear from headlines about Burkina Faso. It was replaced by investment. It was replaced by credit. It was replaced by sovereignty. Every single transaction was recorded through mobile money and biometric identification. Every loan disbursed was tracked in real time on a public dashboard at creditagricole.gov.bf, a website that any person anywhere in the world could visit to see exactly how much money was being lent, to whom, and how much was being repaid. No hidden accounts, no secret budgets, no mysteriously vanishing funds. Just radical transparency in a continent where government finances have traditionally been as opaque as Tanzania's internet blackout. The pilot program had been tested in 6 provinces with 200,000 families during 2024 and early 2025. The results were so extraordinary that international auditors from the World Bank were called in to verify them independently. Repayment rate, 92.3%. Read that number again. In a continent where development aid has created cycles of dependency spanning decades, where governments have defaulted on international loans, where corruption has swallowed billions of dollars meant for the poor, Burkina Faso achieved a 92.3% repayment rate from smallholder farmers. But the transformation went far beyond numbers on a balance sheet. Average productivity increased by 34% for millet and sorghum, the staple crops that feed the nation. Food import costs dropped by $120 million in a single harvest season. For the first time in decades, the word aid began to disappear from headlines about Burkina Faso. It was replaced by investment. It was replaced by credit. It was replaced by sovereignty. The infrastructure that made this possible was as impressive as the financial results. 52,000 new boreholes were drilled, exceeding the target of 50,000. 10,200 solar-powered irrigation pumps were installed. 1,480 community storage facilities were constructed. But the real revolution was not in the infrastructure. It was in the minds of the farmers themselves. For generations, African farmers had been told they were risks too great to invest in, markets too small to matter, producers too poor to trust with credit. The international development complex had created a narrative that portrayed them as beneficiaries of charity rather than partners in business. Burkina Faso's revolution shattered that narrative completely. These farmers were not charity cases. They were entrepreneurs. They were not aid recipients. They were business partners. They were not problems to be solved. They were solutions waiting to be unleashed. And the 92.3% repayment rate proved it. While Tanzania was cutting internet access to hide the truth, Burkina Faso was building digital dashboards to share the truth with the world. While Tanzania was burying bodies in secret locations, Burkina Faso was filling silos with locally grown grain stamped with the names of the villages that produced it. While Tanzania's president was being inaugurated behind closed doors at a military base, Burkina Faso's farmers were celebrating openly in village squares, not because they had received charity, but because they had proven their own worth as partners in their nation's transformation. The contrast could not have been starker. One nation measured success in vote percentages that no independent observer believed. The other measured success in repayment rates that every independent auditor could verify. One nation closed the internet to hide the scale of killing. The other opened dashboards to share the scale of harvest. One nation's leader feared her own people so much she needed soldiers to protect her inauguration. The other nation's farmers trusted their government so much they repaid loans at rates that amazed the world. October 2025 became the month when the world saw the difference between power built on fear and sovereignty built on trust. Tanzania showed us what happens when a government chooses to maintain control through violence. Burkina Faso showed us what happens when a government chooses to build strength through transparency. But this was more than just a comparison between two countries. This was a preview of two possible futures for an entire continent. And the question that emerged from October 2025 was simple but profound. Which path would more African nations choose to follow? Take a second right here to tell us where you are watching from. Type the name of your city, your land, the soil beneath your feet. And as you do, know this. One Nation Africa sends you not just thanks, but a blessing for strength in your hands, for pride in your heart, for light on the road ahead. The comments below become a map of connection, showing that this message reaches far beyond borders. The ripple effects of Burkina Faso's agricultural revolution began spreading across West Africa like seeds carried on the wind. In October 2025, while Tanzania was still counting bodies and the world was still issuing travel warnings, delegations from Mali and Niger quietly arrived in Ouagadougou. They came not as tourists or diplomats, but as students. They wanted to understand how a nation could transform aid into credit, dependency into sovereignty, charity into partnership. The meetings were not held in presidential palaces or five-star hotels. They were conducted in village squares where farmers displayed their harvest records, in community storage facilities where grain was weighed and measured, at digital terminals where repayment transactions were processed in real time. By November 2025, Mali and Niger had signed a memorandum of understanding to establish the platform Agricole du Liptako Gourma, an agricultural platform designed to replicate Burkina Faso's credit model across the broader Sahel region. The West African Development Bank offered to co-finance $300 million to expand the program. But the interest extended far beyond Africa's borders. Asian investors began exploring partnerships. Gulf sovereign wealth funds sent assessment teams. Regional development banks started issuing what they called sovereignty bonds, financial instruments specifically designed to support programs that transformed aid recipients into business partners. The world was beginning to understand that what happened in Burkina Faso was not just an agricultural program. It was a new model for development itself. It proved that African farmers were not risks to be avoided, but partners to be engaged. It demonstrated that transparency was not weakness, but strength. It showed that trust was not naive hope, but sound business practice. While international attention focused on Burkina Faso's success, the leadership behind this transformation began receiving recognition that extended far beyond agricultural policy. Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader who had championed this model of sovereign development, became a symbol of a new generation of African leadership, one that understood that true independence was not declared in speeches but demonstrated in spreadsheets. Ibrahim Traoré had not simply inherited power, he had redefined what power meant. Instead of using sovereignty as a slogan, he had made it measurable. Instead of talking about independence, he had created the financial infrastructure to achieve it. Instead of promising change, he had delivered results that could be audited by anyone with internet access. The contrast with Tanzania became even more striking when viewed through the lens of international response. While European nations were condemning Hassan's government and issuing sanctions, they were simultaneously opening new investment dialogues with Burkina Faso. While the United States remained silent about Tanzania's massacres, American agricultural technology companies were exploring partnerships with Burkina Faso's transparent credit system. The message from the international community was clear. Sovereignty built on trust attracted investment, while power built on fear attracted isolation. Transparency generated confidence, while opacity generated concern. Leaders who empowered their people found partners around the world, while leaders who suppressed their people found only travel warnings and empty statements of concern. This was not about ideology or political systems. This was about results. This was not about East versus West or capitalism versus socialism. This was about competence versus incompetence, transparency versus corruption, trust versus fear. The question became, which vision would Africa choose? The international response to October 2025 revealed as much about global priorities as it did about African realities. When hundreds of people were allegedly killed in Tanzania's election violence, the reaction from different capitals told a story of selective attention and moral inconsistency that should concern anyone who believes in universal human rights. The European Union, United Kingdom, Norway, and Canada issued a joint statement on November 2nd condemning the violence and calling for independent investigations. Their language was clear, direct, and morally unambiguous. We are deeply concerned by reports of excessive use of force by security personnel, restrictions on political freedoms, and limitations on civic and media space. The African Union expressed deep concern about the situation, but stopped short of suspending Tanzania's membership or imposing any meaningful consequences. Regional bodies like the East African Community remained conspicuously silent, apparently valuing stability over accountability. But the response that spoke loudest was the silence from Washington. From the world's most powerful democracy, the nation that claims to champion human rights and democratic values across the globe, came nothing but a travel advisory warning Americans to reconsider travel to Tanzania. No statement from the White House, no condemnation from the Secretary of State, no call for accountability from Congress, no demand for investigations from the State Department, just a bureaucratic travel warning buried in government websites that most people would never read. The contrast with America's response to similar situations in other parts of the world was stark and revealing. When protests erupted in Hong Kong, statements flowed from every level of the American government. When elections were disputed in Venezuela, sanctions followed swiftly. When opposition leaders were arrested in Russia, diplomatic consequences were immediate. But when hundreds of Africans were allegedly killed for demanding democracy, America's response was a travel advisory. This silence sent a message that reverberated far beyond Tanzania's borders. It told African leaders that democracy was optional, that human rights were conditional, that international attention was selective. It suggested that African lives mattered less than Western interests, that African voices deserved less protection than Western investments. Meanwhile, the world's response to Burkina Faso's agricultural revolution was entirely different. International development agencies began studying the program as a model for transformation. Investment funds started exploring partnerships. Regional banks offered expanded credit facilities. Ibrahim Traoré found himself invited to international conferences not as a supplicant seeking aid, but as an innovator sharing solutions. Burkina Faso's delegation to global forums was no longer asking for help. They were offering expertise. The contrast was profound. A nation that killed its citizens received travel warnings and empty statements, while a nation that trusted its citizens received investment offers and partnership proposals. This revealed something fundamental about how the world actually works versus how we pretend it works. Despite all the rhetoric about democracy and human rights, the international community was more impressed by a 92.3% loan repayment rate than by a 97.66% election victory achieved through violence. Money, it seemed, was a more honest judge of governance than ballots. Transparency attracted more investment than propaganda. Trust generated more partnerships than fear. The lesson was clear. In a globalized world, sovereign nations that empowered their citizens attracted sovereign wealth funds, while nations that suppressed their citizens attracted only sovereignty concerns. October 2025 forced Africa to confront a choice that could no longer be postponed or ignored. Not the choice between East and West, not the choice between capitalism and socialism, not the choice between traditional values and modern progress. The choice was simpler and more fundamental. Transparency versus opacity, credit versus crackdowns, trusting your people versus fearing your people. Tanzania chose opacity. They shut down the internet to hide the truth, buried bodies in secret locations to conceal the scale of killing, conducted inaugurations behind closed doors to avoid public scrutiny. They chose to rule through fear, to maintain power through violence, to control through suppression. The results were predictable: international condemnation, economic isolation, political instability masked by military force. Tanzania became a cautionary tale about what happens when governments choose bullets over ballots, prisons over partnerships, secrecy over sovereignty. Burkina Faso chose transparency. They opened their books to public scrutiny, published their data for global verification, conducted their business in digital daylight. They chose to lead through trust, to build power through empowerment, to govern through partnership. The results were remarkable: international investment, economic transformation, political stability rooted in popular support. Burkina Faso became a case study in what happens when governments choose seeds over soldiers, credit over coercion, openness over oppression. Ibrahim Traoré understood something that Hassan had forgotten. In the 21st century, sovereignty is not something you declare, it is something you demonstrate. It is not something you claim, it is something you earn. It is not something you impose, it is something you build. One loan repaid, one harvest completed, one promise kept at a time. The agricultural credit program was not just about farming. It was about proving that African governments could be trusted with resources, that African farmers could be trusted with capital, that African nations could be trusted with sovereignty. Every loan disbursed was a test of trust. Every repayment was a proof of competence. Every harvest was evidence of partnership. The 92.3% repayment rate was not just a financial statistic. It was a statement about what Africa could achieve when its people were treated as partners rather than problems. While Tanzania's government was asking the world to believe impossible election results, Burkina Faso's government was producing auditable financial results. While Tanzania was demanding recognition without providing evidence, Burkina Faso was offering evidence without demanding recognition. The difference was the difference between propaganda and proof, between claims and verification, between words and results. October 2025 will be remembered as the month when Africa saw these two paths clearly, the month when the choice between fear and trust became undeniable, the month when the continent glimpsed two possible futures and had to decide which one it wanted to pursue. Before we close, let us pause. What you have just heard is not simply an episode of history. It is a reminder that sovereignty, dignity, and hope are still alive, waiting to be claimed. If this message has moved you, then subscribe to this channel, not because we ask for numbers, but because we are building a space where voices of independence are honored and where stories of pride continue to be told. By subscribing, you are not just supporting us, you are choosing to walk with us into the next chapter of Africa's unfolding story. The people of Tanzania deserved better. They deserved leaders who invested in credit, not crackdowns. They deserved elections that reflected the will of the people, not the will of those in power. They deserved to protest without being shot, to speak without being jailed, to live without fear. Instead, they received a 97.66% victory built on violence and a travel advisory from the world's most powerful democracy. Their voices were silenced, their internet was cut, their bodies were hidden, and their dignity was trampled in pursuit of impossible election numbers that fooled no one and impressed nobody. But the people of Burkina Faso showed another way. Under leadership that chose trust over fear, they proved that sovereignty could be built on transparency, that strength could be demonstrated through empowerment, that revolution could be measured in repayment rates rather than body counts. Ibrahim Traoré did not just lead a government, he led a transformation. He showed that African leaders could be more than politicians seeking power. They could be partners building prosperity. He proved that African farmers were not charity cases waiting for aid. They were entrepreneurs waiting for investment. He demonstrated that African nations were not problems requiring solutions. They were solutions requiring recognition. The agricultural credit program that began in Burkina Faso represents more than successful policy. It represents a new understanding of what leadership means in Africa. It means trusting your people with resources and watching them prove that trust was justified. It means opening your books to scrutiny and discovering that transparency attracts investment. It means treating farmers as partners and learning that partnership produces better results than paternalism. Ibrahim Traoré and Burkina Faso planted seeds in August 2025 and harvested results by October that amazed the world. They planted trust and harvested a 92.3% repayment. They planted transparency and harvested international investment. They planted sovereignty and harvested recognition that stretched from Mali to the Gulf states. Meanwhile, Tanzania planted fear and reaped silence, allegedly burying evidence in secret locations while the world issued travel warnings. They planted violence and reaped isolation. They planted oppression and reaped condemnation from every corner of the globe except the one that mattered most, the corner where the world's most powerful democracy chose to look the other way. October 2025 showed us two futures for Africa. Tanzania represented the past, the old model of maintaining power through force, controlling information through censorship, ruling through fear rather than leading through inspiration. Burkina Faso represented the future, a new model of building power through trust, sharing information through transparency, leading through empowerment rather than ruling through suppression. The choice between these two futures is still being made across Africa. In every capital, leaders are deciding whether to follow Tanzania's path of opacity and violence or Burkina Faso's path of transparency and trust. The answer to Tanzania's tragedy is already growing in Burkina Faso's fields. The question is, which path more African nations will choose? Because in the end, leadership is a choice. And in October 2025, two leaders made their choices clear. One chose fear, the other chose trust. One closed the internet, the other opened the books. One built power on graves, the other built sovereignty on harvests. And only one of those choices plants seeds for tomorrow.